Cathryn, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. So I'm Cathryn Sterling. I had worked as an engineer for many years. The last 5 years was at NASA as a systems engineer on a launch vehicle design that we were working on. I quit about 10 years ago, though, to raise my children. And in that time, I started a Christian apologetics ministry and wrote a book called Teaching Others to Defend Christianity, right here. And so that's kind of what I do now. I homeschool my children, and that's, I guess, it.
Someone in the chat made the joke, doesn't take a rocket scientist. Like, oh, well, I am a rocket scientist.
Yeah.
So I am an atheist, by which I mean I believe that all of the evidence seems to indicate a natural hypothesis opposed to a God. Could you tell me some of the reasons and evidences you think that indicate a God over naturalism?
That's funny you phrase that question like that's just like a 30-second answer. But that's really what we're here to talk about. So obviously, I am a Christian. I've been a Christian for a long time. And it's one of those things that over my life, I've continued to look at the evidence and see that to me, the evidence is more compelling that there must be a God, and specifically that it is the God described in the Bible. And there's, to me, that it's an accumulation of all kinds of different fields of science and philosophy and reasoning that we can look at that point to there must be a God. And it kind of boils down to, I think, in some ways, I've said that you could describe this using 4 words. I think irreducible complexity and Cambrian explosion, to me, are 2 of the most compelling arguments that there must be a God that created. Although there's lots of other arguments and discussions that you could get into that talk about that. But for me, it's really looking at the design of life, the fact that there is information, and particularly when we look at our DNA, that there's information that is directing the cell for what to make, for how many fingers, how many limbs, how many eyes, how it's going to be structured, the organization that you find within organisms, the irreducibly complex mechanisms that actually direct life and allow for life to continue. And that, again, there's thousands of different examples that you could look at, but to me, the most compelling, because whatever a view of origins that you have, whether it's atheism through Darwinian evolution or through creation with intelligent design from a creator, DNA replication has to work and it has to function. And there's so many different components that are required to be present at the same time, in the same location, in the right amounts, in the right order, in order for DNA replication to work. And so that is just one example of what an irreducibly complex system would look like. And it's necessary for life to continue. If we didn't have a method of replicating DNA, then life could not continue. So what model best explains how that type of mechanism, that type of system is going to exist? And I think it's clear that it is designed, that you have multiple components that have to be working together in an integrated fashion. And that really points to that there's some sort of intelligence behind it to put that system in place. And like I said, without that, life can't continue, whatever model of origins you want to cling to. And especially when you look at what's actually being replicated. So not only do we need all of these components in order to replicate DNA, what is it that we're actually replicating? And it's information, and which is different from just data. Data is just a bunch of facts, but information is actually guiding and directing different things. And so it's not just data, but it's actually informing the cell and what to do. And so that's another level of complexity that we would recognize requires intelligence. But then when you take that information and you put it into a coded fashion, that requires intelligence as well, to put data, right, that's actually informing and directing things, giving instructions to the cell, and then actually writing that in a coded fashion is what is the logical conclusion, is that there's an intelligent force behind that that's doing that. And we would draw that conclusion in anything else in life. I've kind of used the example sometimes about, when you have those some assembly required projects, which as an engineer, I love those. I love getting, the furniture that you have to put together, but it always comes with those instructions. And so the instructions are like the DNA. They're guiding you and directing you in what order to put things together, how to put this together. That doesn't even get into where the parts come from, right? We could have a whole different discussion about that. But if you then got that instruction manual of how to assemble your furniture and it's written in a code, there has to be some sort of intelligence behind that understands the system, understands how it needs to be put together, that gives you that information, that gives you those directions and instructions, but then can put it into a coded fashion. And that's really what we see in biology, down to the most basic of organisms, is that there has to be that coded information. And so I think the logical conclusion is that there's intelligence behind that.
Cool. So there's a few things you mentioned there. First thing is irreducible complexity. So let's talk about that a little bit. My interpretation of irreducible complexity is that it's kind of like a stone arch. A stone arch is, you have a bunch of stones that are like placed on top of one another, and they all connect to form an arch. And if you take one away, they all fall.
Right.
But to form a stone arch, you don't just place all of those in their initial position right away. What you do is you build a layer, an underlayer, that fills the arch underneath, and then you place the consecutive curved arches on top of those, and then you remove the ones at the bottom. And so even though the complete structure is irreducibly complex, if you remove any one piece, the entire structure will fall. The pieces that were used to build that aren't there anymore. And the same thing happens in evolution. It seems like, for example, caterpillars and butterflies. Caterpillars don't have any reproductive organs, so they couldn't possibly reproduce until after they became butterflies. This would seem like a problem for evolution, because if they, prior to evolving the butterfly form, there's no way for them to reproduce. So how could caterpillars on their own ever evolve butterflies, because they don't have a way to reproduce? Well, the way they did was that they had sexual organs prior to becoming butterflies, but once they did become butterflies, they no longer needed those, and so they lost them. And so the irreducible complexity of the butterfly, meaning that it needs to become a butterfly in order to reproduce, was accomplished because the caterpillars had these underlayer rocks before the irreducible complexity that they then lost in the future once they became butterflies. So it seems like irreducible complexity can be explained by having these underlayer kinds of structures that were then lost later on in the evolutionary process.
That's an interesting example. And I definitely want to come back and talk about the butterfly, because I think that is a fascinating example. But just curious, though, if you did walk up and see a bridge or the stone arch, would you assume that it came there naturally, or that somebody built it that way?
Well, there are many that come naturally, so it depends on where it was.
Right. But the example that you're giving is that somebody planned to develop this arch, and they had a method of how to go about doing it. So I just find that interesting that you pull from something that would be designed to give evidence that it was naturally made that way.
Well, actually,
for that specific type of arch that you're talking about. Now, yes.
No. So the specific type of arch I'm talking about occurs naturally in nature too. Like rivers cut out stone arches from under different pathways all the time, and so the structure is formed in the exact same way, where you have a under form of rocks, and then the bottom is cut away. And so it's irreducibly complex, because if you take away any of the rocks that form the big canyon like bridge thingy, it'll all collapse. But the way it was built was also from removing the stuff underneath. And so both, whether it's formed naturally or by design, they're both irreducibly complex, and they both are formed in the same process.
Well, so when we look at the butterfly example, because that's what I really wanted to get back into, because the metamorphosis is fascinating, and it's even to the point that scientists and biologists don't fully understand exactly what all happens when that caterpillar forms a chrysalis, what's actually making it do all those changes, because the body for the caterpillar has to change drastically to turn into the butterfly. And I do think this is a problem for evolution, as to what change would have to happen first within the caterpillar for it to begin this process of metamorphosis. Because really the idea behind Darwinian evolution is that these changes can't happen all at one time. It has to be done incrementally, one small micromutation at a time. Because if you have a drastic wholesale change to an organism, that looks more like creation than it does evolution. nature is going to take these slow, slight successive modifications. And that's how Darwin described it, is it's going to be these slight successive modifications over a long period of time. So we have to go back and look at, well, what one slight modification could happen first, yet the caterpillar still survive, even though it's not fully caterpillar, yet it's not fully butterfly. And so the past several years, like I said, I homeschooled my children, but even before they were of school age, I love this company called Insect Lore, because you can order a cup of caterpillars and then you get to watch the whole process of them turning into butterflies. So I've done it every spring. I think at this point, I probably enjoy it more than the kids do. But you get 5, just born caterpillars in this little cup of basically resin for it to stay in this cup, and it eats and grows until they become caterpillars, and eventually they'll crawl up to the lid of this cup and they'll form the chrysalis. And so once they've formed and they've kind of hardened into that a little bit, you take the lid of the cup off and you put it into a butterfly net, so that when they hatched, you've got the butterflies in the net, and you can drop fruit in there, and it's really cool to watch. But I remember one year I saw one, and the butterfly started to hatch. It hatched out and it stopped. It didn't fully come out, so its wings were still folded up, and it just sat there for about a day. And I kept watching this guy to figure out, what is he going to do? And the next day he finally crawls out, but his wings, because he didn't fully come out and dry off his wings the way all the other butterflies do, they dried in that crumpled position. He even had a chunk of his chrysalis still stuck to his head. This guy's clearly not going to make it. So I have to explain to the kids, like, well, we're going to release him, but he'll be eaten pretty fast. We're feeding the birds at this point. But it was interesting to watch, because what it highlighted is how important every single step of that metamorphosis is for the success of the butterfly. So it doesn't have generations for the caterpillar, through evolutionary slight successive modifications, to try to get this right. It has to be completely right in one shot for you to actually have a viable butterfly at the end of the metamorphosis. So I find it difficult to understand how evolution is going to explain, by one slight successive modification at a time, over many generations, over thousands of years, that this caterpillar is going to acquire everything that it needs to fully undergo metamorphosis to become a successful butterfly. Because if one thing goes wrong, it's bird food, and you don't get another generation of the caterpillars to try to get that right. So I see what you're saying, that yes, you could look at it at an arch that the river has eroded through, so that maybe there was this basic process of DNA, because this really came from what I said about DNA replication, that now we see the arch, and like the basic model of DNA replication has eroded away. But we have to start asking the question, what is it that is propelling that caterpillar to have changed? So if we're going to go with a caterpillar example, what is it through nature that would have forced it to go through acquiring this process of metamorphosis to become a butterfly, and then eventually get rid of all of the reproductive methods of a caterpillar, so that we're left with only reproductive methods with the butterfly? What is it that nature is going to drive it to do that? If caterpillars are successfully reproducing more caterpillars without having this complicated process of metamorphosis, that's very tricky, that has to be completely right all at one time, why is nature going to drive it in that direction? And how is it going to do that one slight step at a time?
Sure. So the reason why is butterflies would be better at it. So the reason, for example, pollen will have feathers essentially on it, so that it gets caught by the wind and it can go farther. And so wings allow the animal with the DNA to go farther, to travel farther, to reproduce more often. And so it's a more successful
Well, but
reproducer.
I don't think that's really a valid explanation. I mean, there are lots of animals that reproduce successfully without having to have wings. So, and again, like I said, metamorphosis is a very complicated process. It has to figure out how to basically inside the chrysalis, the caterpillar's body is completely broken down into juice. And then the DNA, the information in there, the epigenetic information is redirecting it to reassemble an entirely new body plan, with wings that have to function, with muscles that have to operate the wings, with different feeding mechanisms. It's going to have a different diet. So this is a drastic change. And an evolutionist is going to have to explain how one successive modification at a time would allow that to be successful It has, so for a mutation, for this, evolutionary change over a macroevolutionary concept to work, each incremental stage has to be successful, meaning it has to survive, right? We have to be now more fit to survive than what was before us, and we have to reproduce. But you can only do one slight change at a time. And I think that's very difficult to explain how is a caterpillar that's not fully butterfly, yet not fully caterpillar, changing its organs and then undergoing metamorphosis with only one slight successive modification at a time. It's very difficult to explain.
Because it doesn't need to be a butterfly. Like birds that existed today didn't exist in the same form at the existence of caterpillars. And so they didn't need to have the same evolutionary advantages as butterflies today.
Well, but it does have to be fully. So if it's going to start losing the reproductive aspect of this is very important, because if it can't fully reproduce as a caterpillar, but it's not fully butterfly, you have a hard time having the next generation to gain a mutation to do this, especially when mutations are not giving new information, it's taking information away. Right, especially in your example that evolution over time is going to erode away all the rocks underneath the bridge. Mutations detract; they take away information out of the genetic code instead of adding new information to it.
Right. Well, we can actually look at the DNA of the butterflies and know exactly how that happened. What happened is that the caterpillars had the sexual organs, and when they evolved the capability to become butterflies, the butterflies also then evolved sexual organs separately. And so they only sexually reproduced as caterpillars and then became butterflies outside of that. And the butterflies then evolved sexual organs. So both had sexual organs. And then once both had sexual organs, the ones that became butterfly were more successful and reproduced more, which then outcompeted the other ones for food sources and survivability. And so as they didn't need to reproduce as caterpillars anymore, they only tend to reproduce as butterflies, and they became vestigial organs in the caterpillars, and then they lost them, kind of like the fish in the caves who lost their eyes. The vestigial organs were lost over time and then only remained in the butterflies because they were being used.
But that's a lot of speculation.
Well, we can look at the DNA and know what happens. Like we can see the patterns in the DNA and check the patterns to those of other species to see the evolutionary tree that predated them. So we can, like, using the same way we can know that you're related to your children, we can know that butterflies are related to different kinds of ancestors, different kinds of moths or whatever at certain rates. So we can see how far
away they are. No, but you're having to show that caterpillars reproduce as caterpillars. So, and that's speculation as to the fact that they actually had sexual reproductive organs. That's speculation.
No, I think we already have examples of that. It's like worms.
That's not the same thing.
Oh, well, we can show the genetic relation between worms and caterpillars. And so we can show that there are the same genes that they use for reproduction existed in this species and in this.
We're talking about the actual organs, though. So I think that's still a lot of speculation to say that you can see that the caterpillars had sexual organs that then they lost. That's still some speculation there that is the case.
Well, no, we can show it genetically.
No,
so it's not really.
You're showing it hypothetically. You're not showing it in actuality.
So the evidence we have of that is that we can look at the patterns in the DNA and compare the patterns to other species and see if they're similar. So this slight changes result in, oh, hey, this guy now has sexual reproductive organs and they have the same general patterns as caterpillars did previously before these new evolutionary trees. Then it's reasonable to infer they had sexual organs because they have the same genetic patterns that produce sexual organs.
Well, okay. I think we're just going to have to agree to disagree that I think a lot of what when you look at a lot of the evolutionary trees, a lot of it is a hypothetical ancestry that is not verified through fossil record or through actual lineage through organisms. And that's really where when you look at the Cambrian explosion, right? That's what when you look at all this together, we have all of those drastically different body plans showing up at the same time And even Dawkins himself says it's as if they don't have any evolutionary history at all, which in fact they don't. So when you have all of those different organisms showing up alongside each other at the same time in the same rock layer, then it removes the ability for them. Anything that connects them are if you look at all of the diagrams of that, they're hypothetical. They're not actual fossil record, actual confirmation of organs and all of that we see. So that's where I think, you're looking at, I think you're making a big leap to say that the caterpillar had sexual organs to reproduce its caterpillars, and now we just don't see them anymore. I think that's a big leap, in my opinion.
So like if you have a hypothesis, you're comparing two different hypotheses, and one says, I think they had sexual organs, and if they have sexual organs, then we should be able to see the same patterns in the DNA of the caterpillars that we see in the relations of the worms. So they had a common ancestor. And if they had a common ancestor, they both had sexual organs.
Well, okay, but see, that's where the logic falls apart, is that you're inserting common ancestor into your premise. You're taking what you find as your conclusion, but you're taking what you want as your conclusion and inserting into your premise, your hypothesis. Because you're assuming common ancestry when you go into it. And so does that make sense?
So every hypothesis, you always assume your conclusion. So you say, if God exists, then I would expect to see this. And then you look to see if the thing that you're looking for is there. And if it is, that's confirmation of your hypothesis. So if the hypothesis is evolution is true, common ancestry is true, then we are going to look and we're going to see the same genetic patterns in worms and caterpillars. And then we look and we see, and they have the same genetic patterns. And so if confirmation of the observation is evidence of the hypothesis, which is evolution and common ancestry. So with every hypothesis, you always start with, you assume it's true, and then what would you expect to see if it was true?
I understand how the hypothesis works, but what I'm saying is you're using some circular logic when you walk through that the way that you described that, is all I'm saying.
How? So I start with a hypothesis, evolution is true. If evolution is true, what would we expect to see? Well, we'd expect to see the same genetic patterns in worms and caterpillars that would represent what we'd expect to happen if there were common ancestors. And then we look and we find it. Which part of that is circular?
Well, because when you're talking about, you're looking, well, never mind.
Well, let me use a God example. So if Christianity is true and Jesus rose from the dead, when I die, I will see God. I'll meet God at the pearly gates. If I then die and meet God at the pearly gates, that would be evidence of Christianity, wouldn't it?
Well, okay. So let me go back to here's what I'm trying to say is that the patterns of the DNA you're saying show common ancestry. I'm saying show a common designer. And so you're going to see a commonality in the DNA there, but you're going to draw your conclusion from your predisposed worldview, and I'm going to draw my conclusion from my worldview. So that, I guess that's what I'm trying to say, is that you want to find the common ancestry. And so when there's a commonality, instead of saying there are going to be common features of DNA because of what DNA is, you're then inferring that that's going to reaffirm a common ancestry, when I would say that's a common designer. But that's not showing that caterpillars reproduce as caterpillars in the same way that you're drawing that conclusion from the fact that they have a similar DNA structure. Does that make sense? That's what I was trying to say, is that there's the circular logic there, in that you're inserting, therefore there must be a common ancestor because there's commonality in DNA. Whereas I would say there's a common design theme because of the designer, even though we're looking at the same some commonality of the DNA. That's what I was trying to get to about inserting your conclusion into the premise of of the logic there.
Yeah, I think
Does that make sense?
Yes, I think you're bringing up a thing that's known in science as a difference between post hoc versus prediction. So like if we came up with a piece of evidence and like we both saw something at the same time, and I said, oh, that's evidence of leprechauns, and you said, no, it's evidence of unicorns, that's just post hoc reasoning. We're seeing the evidence, and after we see the evidence, we make up a hypothesis to explain the evidence. But future prediction doesn't work that way. Future prediction isn't circular like that. It's saying, if I assume my hypothesis is true, I'm going to now go look for evidence in a specific location, and I predict I'm going to find it. And if I find that evidence after I predicted it, not before, or yeah, after I predicted it, then that would be confirmation of my hypothesis. So it's not circular anymore. It's only circular if you explain the evidence after you find it. If you explain the evidence before you find it, that's really good reason to believe that your model is correct. And so this evidence of DNA I'm giving is something that we predicted before we ever knew anything about DNA. This is like, if evolution is the case, if there is a common ancestor, if there is a single organism that all life came from, we expect to see exact patterns in DNA that will match exactly the evolutionary tree, just like we do in evolutionary comparisons between parents and grandparents and siblings. And when we compare different animals, we find, for example, in ERVs, endogenous retroviruses, that we can find exact patterns of where these animals had a common ancestry with a virus that injected DNA into its reproductive cells that then created or led to multiple species who all have this exact same marker and this exact same position in their 3 billion long base pair chain. So it could either be just complete coincidence that this ERV, this virus DNA, which doesn't do anything to benefit the DNA, happens to be in this exact location. So we know that this virus injected its DNA in this exact location for many different species, thousands of species at the exact same location. It could just be chance, or it seems more likely to say that it probably had common ancestors where an ERV injected its virus DNA at that point, and then every one of its reproductive ancestors all had the same pattern because that's how the DNA reproduced. So which do you think is a more plausible explanation there, since that's something we predicted beforehand and we're not just explaining it after the fact? Don't you think that counts as evidence for evolution?
Well, so to you could look at it in the same way that to me, we need to follow the actual evidence to see what is the most logical conclusion. So I think we agree on that point. To me, when I see that there is information that is like what I said in the beginning, that is giving the directions and the instruction code in order to form an organism. If you were to take whether you're an atheist or a theist or whatever off the table, and you just said, if somebody gave you a booklet of information, would you conclude that there's an intelligent source behind it or not? And so to me, that is truly following where does the science lead. If there's information contained in that DNA, which there is, and it's information contained in a code, which it is, then that means something intelligent had to put that there. Especially when the more we look at genetics and we see that there's even epigenetic information that's directing the genes and how they're to assemble and what they're to do. There is something guiding and directing these processes. And if you were to remove evolution, theistic, whatever off the table, you would look at information in a code and say there has to be intelligence behind it, that's not a naturally occurring thing. Now, patterns can occur in nature, but patterns is not information. So that's where I come back to. And yes, speciation does occur. But I think when you step back and you look at if evolution were true, what would we see in the fossil record? And we would see this gradation that, Darwin's tree of life, how it dictated that pattern would show up in the fossil records. And it doesn't show up that way. And Darwin knew that. Most of his critics, when he first published his book, were paleontologists. They were digging in the dirt. They were looking at the rocks. They were the ones pushing back. The archaeologists, the paleontologists, they were pushing back on Darwin's theory because they knew that's not what the fossil record showed. And so most of his contemporaries had very, very harsh things to say to Darwin about putting this theory forward, because this is not what was being shown in the Cambrian rock layer. And like I said, Dawkins said it himself, that it's as though these 26 different phylums show up on the scene that are drastically different body plans without any evolutionary history in the oldest rock layer. And so we're not seeing this billions of years build up from something very simple into the more complex things the way Darwin's tree of life shows it. So you'd have to go back and circle to that if evolution were true, what would you see? You would see something totally different in the fossil record than what we do see. And so you'd have to go back to that hypothesis and say, well, maybe Darwinian evolution is not true because these things are not merging and evolving into one another through the fossil record.
So a few things there. One is information theory. So I'm pretty well acquainted with information theory, and Claude Shannon wrote a paper on information theory. He's the guy who essentially made it up, and he defines information as a physical system or mathematical model system that produces such a sequence of symbols governed by a set of probabilities known as a stochastic process. And so stochastic means random. So it's a random process that produces these kinds of symbols. And so in the definition of information theory, information is produced by nature all the time. Particles have information, hurricanes have information, tornadoes have information, crystals have information. Every physical thing has information, and these informational patterns seem to be a result of stochastic random systems of interactions in physical forces. So the definition of information in most physics and mathematics doesn't say anything about a designer. It's just stochastic process, a pattern stochastic process. So it seems like there's no problem with DNA or information in that kind of a sense being produced by a natural process, not by definition at least. The second thing you mentioned was the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion, as I understand it, happened over millions of years. It's a fast process in the time scale of evolution, but it's still millions of years. It's not like a small thing. And the only thing that changed was that they started to develop harder shells. So we don't see like the origin of completely new species. We see slight changes where their skeletal structures became larger and large enough to be encapsulated and form fossils where they weren't before. So soft shell things started to gain hard shells, and we would tend to expect to see that if there was an evolutionary advantage, which is why we see multiple different species, each developing eyesight in different ways. I think there's at least like 30 different ways that eyes developed independently, like the mantis shrimp, the octopus, humans, birds. They didn't necessarily all have the exact same common ancestor from eyes. Eyes developed in different ways. And so we could see hard body, hard shell things develop or evolve from different starting points in different species. And that's perfectly consistent with evolution,
No,
especially over millions of years.
I think that's a misrepresentation of what's actually the significance of the Cambrian explosion. Like you said, it was over millions of years, but that's a blip in time when you're talking about, if evolution took 4.2 billion, that is, and that's what's called an explosion, because these things rapidly showed up on the scene. And if you're going to talk about these merging into each other, that's not possible mathematically for that to happen in those millions of years. So if all of these different,
what do you mean by merging into one another?
Okay, if all of these 26 different phyla are showing up at the same time in the Cambrian explosion, and that's over millions of years, that is nowhere near enough time for evolution to produce those different types of body plans, especially when the Precambrian era was basically sponge cells. So if you go back and look what they found in Xinjiang, China, when they have fossilized sponge embryos, that tells us that at some point some soft-bodied things can fossilize. And then there's nothing until we have all of this explosion of life. And it is an explosion because that is a short period of time when you're talking over the grand scale of the billions of years that evolution needs. Actually, that's not even enough time mathematically to look at having a mutation permeate through the entire population and affect the type of change it needs to change the body plan of an organism. Okay. And there's this whole issue of when is that evolution going to take place within the organism? So if you're going to go from like a spider, a 2-segmented organism, to an ant that has 3 segments, you have to figure out when in that embryonic development is that mutation going to take place. And what they found when they do these genetic analysis with mutations, if the mutation occurs later in the embryonic development, that body plan for a 3-segmented organism is already set, which means you're not going to evolve from a 2-segmented to a 3-segmented organism. But if it happens earlier, before that body plan is set, so that it could actually change from 2-segment to 3-segment, it destroys the embryo. So there's this issue of when is that type of mutation going to occur to actually change the body plan, which is the only way you can change from one organism type to another. But to say that all that happened in the Cambrian explosion is that soft things turned into hard shell things, that's a misrepresentation of what all happened there, because you have all of those different body plans showing up at the same time. And yes, we're talking time as in millions of years, but even in 5 million years, that is not enough time for the evolutionary process that you're trusting in to take place throughout all of those populations and change those body plans of those organisms.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean there, because the body plans were already there. They were already soft bodies. All they did was they already had even bones in their bodies. Like there were small bones, and in the
Okay, so you still have
Chinese
to explain where
excavations,
all of those different body plans came from, right? So you're not
they were
actually
already there.
explaining already there from where, right?
Uh,
All you're doing is shoving it further back in time and into the Precambrian era, and that's just like I said, those were the sponge embryos. So that's a drastically different type of organism to show up in the fossil record.
Well, the organism was already there. They just developed a shell. So the only thing that changed was the size of their bones. Their bones grew bigger.
So explain where the organisms were already there. What do you mean by that?
So the Cambrian explosion is an explosion of hard bodied parts of the animals. So the animals, there were already millions of soft body animals there, and they were reproducing and evolving for millions of years prior to the Cambrian explosion. And in the Cambrian explosion, they developed larger hard bodies like shells.
Like, so you're saying the reason why there's no evidence of that is because they were all soft bodied, so therefore they did not fossilize. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, we do have evidence of this, like because they already had shells or they already had spinal structures which did fossilize and are there, that in the structures that were found in the China thing that you mentioned. So there were already bones prior to the Cambrian explosion. They're just usually small spines and things, and those developed into larger, bigger bones. So we already have
what they found in China is the basically sponge embryo fossilizations. Not all of the variety of life that we see in the Cambrian explosion.
Well, right, because we couldn't see all of that until the bones were formed. But
That's what I'm trying to get at. So you're saying all of those organisms already existed, but there's no evidence of that because they didn't fossilize.
They did. So prior to having the big shells on their backs, they had spines, and those spines did fossilize. So we have the spines that are essentially the same shape as the spines in the shell guys, but without the shells.
Okay. But they're all alongside each other at the same time. There's not this incremental increasing in complexity pattern that you would have to have for Darwinian evolution to exist.
Yeah. So the thing I'm mentioning is underneath the shell guys. So it's before those guys.
No, all you're saying is the Cambrian explosion just simply added shells to all the different body plans, not that new body plans formed.
Yeah.
Right, which is affirming what I'm saying. That all of those body plans were existing alongside each other, not slowly evolving into one another from one common ancestor.
I'm not sure what you're saying. So like just to read from the academic journal, like many of the Cambrian animals possessed some type of hard mineralized structure, spines, spicules, plates, etc. In many of the cases, these often very tiny mineralized structures are all that are found as fossils. So there are little tiny parts that were found as fossils prior to the bigger parts.
Okay, but it's still, what I'm trying to get at is that you have different body plans of organisms that are alongside one another. According to Darwin's tree of life, you need to have one type that eventually turn and evolve into other types of body plans. But the fossil record doesn't show that. It shows that they're all there at the same time.
Right, because there are already millions of body plans that already existed prior to the Cambrian explosion.
Without an evolutionary history, that we're saying the same thing, that they're all there at the same time, not gradually merging and blurring into one another from an intermediate species.
Okay, so there's millions of different species that existed tens of millions of years before the Cambrian explosion. And then at the Cambrian explosion, lots of them started to develop harder shells. So the only evolutionary change in the Cambrian explosion is the hard shells part. That's the only addition that happened there, essentially.
Okay, if that's what you're stating, then all you've done is you've driven the problem further back in time, and you've actually made it more complicated for evolution to have happened, because you're still saying all of these things are existing alongside one another.
Yeah.
Right. Not in that merging fashion that Darwin's tree of life would require.
Right. That happened millions of years before the Cambrian explosion.
Okay, I think we're talking past one another on this one. So
right. I just encourage you to look at the scientific papers that actually demonstrate this. The consensus in science is, yeah, the Cambrian explosion isn't actually particularly impressive for scientists. Yeah, it fits exactly with Darwinian evolution. It's not really that spicy. But so you mentioned abiogenesis, that like the origin of life itself. So using the hypothesis thing, like we have two hypotheses. One is that it was created by an intelligent designer. One is that it was created by natural processes. And we know that cells are very, very complicated, that say there's like 10,000 different steps that need to happen in order to make a cell, or whatever, step from 1 to 10,000 in order. In the naturalist hypothesis, we make predictions about certain steps, like step 347 or something. And we can say, oh, look, RNA can form corpuscles on clay. And that confirms that our prediction that this step 347 can happen naturally without any need of a designer. And we have hundreds and hundreds of these examples where one of the steps is predicted that we would be able to find it occurring in nature without any effect of any intelligent designer whatsoever. And then we find it, we discovered it. So each one of these examples is a case where the natural hypothesis was able to predict we would find something before we found it, and then check it off the list. Like, yep, this step is done. We discovered it naturally. And that would be evidence for the naturalist hypothesis. But I don't see any evidence for the design hypothesis. I don't see anyone taking the design hypothesis that they think a God designed it and then predicting into the future what we'd expect to see, or something we don't know yet, and then getting it right. I've never seen that happen. So to me, it seems like the natural hypothesis has a much more abundant basis of evidence because it can do this than the intelligence hypothesis.
All right. So I'm sorry, you cut out a little bit there. So I missed a little bit of what you were saying in the middle. Whatever glitch through the internet, I guess. So you'll have to repeat a little bit about what you said, because I missed the middle section of what you were talking about. Can you say that again?
Yeah. So cells are really complicated. They have like 10,000 steps that are required to make a functioning cell. And we both are trying to explain how this happened. We have two hypotheses, the God hypothesis and the naturalist hypothesis. But the naturalist hypothesis predicts that if this was done by natural processes, we'd be able to find certain steps, like step 347. So we're not trying to find step 1 to step 1,000 in order, but we can find specific steps, like 347 is where RNA forms on clay and forms corpuscles, something like that. And if this was done from a naturalist hypothesis, we'd be able to discover this occurring in nature. And when we do discover it, which we have in many papers, we can check that off the list and say, yes, this is a confirmation of our hypothesis. It's evidence of the naturalist hypothesis. But since I don't see any of the design hypothesis being able to do that and infer anything about future information, it seems like because we have hundreds and hundreds of examples of the naturalist hypothesis predicting these steps would be found in nature and then finding them, that seems to be significantly better evidence for that hypothesis than the design one.
Okay. All right. So thank you. Because after you said some of that, that's what I missed. So I think that's an interesting point. I've not read all of that about finding, in your terms, like step 347 of the 1,000-step process or whatever. So to speak for, a design hypothesis working that way, I mean, I don't know. That's not my field of interest, or, that's not, I guess, really the work that I'm engaged in. So I can't speak to why that is or is not taking place. But I do think, that is a significant leap to go from a non-living thing to a living thing, that that I think, evolutionists would have to try to explain. And so the fact that you can explain some things in a natural process, I don't think that precludes that God exists, because God did create nature. And so there are natural processes. So at no point would I say, well, nature can't be used to explain anything. I mean, God set this nature and the laws and the predictability about it. I think in some ways it does go back to prove that there must be a God, because of its predictability. Because we do have these laws established that we can follow, and that this world functions in. Something had to set those parameters in place. And so the fact that we can do repeatable things, I think shows that there is a constancy, a consistency about nature, that if everything were random, I don't know that we could have that same kind of predictability if it were, if this universe were randomly generated. So, there is still the issue of step one, right? That step one is what's really important. So the fact that steps, 10 through 800 or whatever can happen through a natural process, I don't think that removes God from the table. I think that just says God created a pretty awesome system that we're still trying to understand. And I think that's what's really impressive about when you look at a lot of the papers and the studies that are being done, is this link between biology and systems engineering. And since my background is systems engineering, although I've always loved biology, I think that's where I always love looking into these different examples, is as a systems engineer, I can see when we're designing a system, all the work that goes into it, all the intelligence and planning, and that you have to change a system as a whole in order for it to still function. And in the world of biology, it has to function, it has to survive, and it has to reproduce. So, a lot of times I've used those examples from the work that I did at NASA, in looking at different systems that have to work together. And if we have a design change, everyone has to be on board and look through it. Okay, so if the electronics has changed the system, then what does that do to the propulsion? What does that do to the structure? Do we have human access to that? If we have to change out batteries, if we have to, upload different software, you have to look at the whole thing before you make one small change. And there's actually a great quote. I don't know if I could pull it up quickly, but where they talk about, like, if you were to make one small change to a bird, right? If you were to increase its heart, what all other systems is it going to throw out of whack and it not be able to continue to function and live if you're changing its heart in order for it to become a different organism? You'd have to change the whole thing at once instead of these incremental, slight, successive modifications. So I don't know how I got into all of that from what you were talking about with the different steps of generating or organizing a cell. I think the key is, yes, you can explain lots of things through nature and through natural processes, but that step one is going to be that critical thing. And I think the fact that we can plan and predict things is an indication that this is not a randomly assembled universe. So, how to explain other studies that, like you said, why are people that are theists not studying these things? I don't know. I can't speak to that. That's not in my field. But anyway, I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I think that step one is the critical thing. Can you get a living thing from a non-living thing? And I think all of, what we've looked at historically through science says that's not possible.
Well, so I'd agree with what you first said, that it doesn't eliminate God from the table. Like, it's just comparing two hypotheses, saying, is the origin of life a result of natural processes, or is it a result of a designer, like, doing it by hand, essentially? Maybe God, of course, could have just started the universe and then just had abiogenesis happen naturally as a part of his plan or something. So it wouldn't disprove God, even if abiogenesis were true. But if we're comparing hypotheses, the one that has the better evidence is the one that's able to say, if my hypothesis is true, here's what we would expect to see, and then do some experiment and see if we find that result. And whichever hypothesis can do that seems to be the better hypothesis. And it seems like the naturalist abiogenesis hypothesis for the origin of life is the one that's doing that, whereas the design one is not. So to me, it seems like that's the better hypothesis for abiogenesis in the case. Of course, it doesn't eliminate God from, like, creation of the universe or anything. That would be a different
Well,
topic.
but it's also not actually proving abiogenesis. That's still, you're just showing that there's a part of it that could happen naturally, but not that there's actually the leap from non-living to living.
Right. So it's like
Right.
induction. So if I have a model that I can predict where like 10 stars are going to be in the future or whatever, and that model is that it's caused by gravitational waves or something, and it doesn't predict all of the stars, but because it does successfully predict 10 of them, that would be evidence that the model is correct, that gravitational waves are what are moving the stars.
No,
And
I see what you're saying with that, but I think that's really a different thing when you're talking about abiogenesis. I think the fact that you can say some things happen naturally only proves that some things happen naturally. I don't think that's a clear path of inductive reasoning to go back and say abiogenesis is a thing because we can prove step 347 is a thing. I think that's a different leap in the reasoning path for that, because that's such a drastic statement to say that abiogenesis occurs.
I'm not quite understanding, because I understand that's the entire thing in science, like in astronomy and cosmology. When we look out in the universe, we have no idea how anything happens. We discover individual parts. Like, oh, we can explain gamma ray bursts because of black holes or whatever. Oh, we can look at different kinds of high particle energies that come into contact with people's eyes, and that explains the lights that NASA sees. It seems like we were explaining things piecemeal, just like with abiogenesis, where there's like 10,000 things we don't know, and we'd say, oh, look, step 347 is gamma ray burst. That can explain that new thing that we didn't understand yet. So I think that's how all of the scientific process works. I don't see why it would be different for abiogenesis.
Well, I think because I see what you're saying, but I still think that's a I don't think that's breaking with what science actually does. I just think that's a different line of reasoning that you're trying to prove that's outside of I think that's a larger leap out of what the evidence is actually showing you to then draw that conclusion, in my opinion. I just think that's a larger conclusion to draw than what that evidence is actually pointing to. But that's...
I guess I can partially agree with that, because I think like it's a hypothesis, and the hypothesis makes predictions, and so any confirmed predictions is evidence, but it wouldn't necessarily be sufficient evidence.
Right.
But my only argument here is that because the hypothesis makes predictions that are correct, that is evidence, so that's something. But I don't see any on the design side. So by default, even if it isn't like sufficient evidence, it's still more than is on the design side, as far as I can tell.
Well, that's something I'll have to go look into, I guess, if there are hypotheses of that, from, in that line of reasoning from the design side. I'm just not, I can't speak for the whole field for that, so I don't know.
Yeah, so I just suggest there's a really good article in New Scientist called First Life, The Search for the First Replicator by Michael Marshall, and it just lists all the different, like the steps I'm kind of listing of how different things were found and across 10-year time period. So they have like dozens of studies, and each one is like a different step in the process. All right, you mentioned we can do repeatable things, like in the universe is orderly. I mean, I agree with that. I totally think it is in many cases. I think that we can change some of the laws, like gravitation could have been repulsive at the early universe inflation. That wouldn't be a problem. But why would that be indicative of a God? Like, I don't think, even if there was no God, I'd still think that the universe wouldn't be perfectly random. I think that would be even more ridiculous.
Well, I mean, I think that's kind of getting into, so I think the Darwinian theory, the naturalistic model, it is based on everything being random. So I find that interesting, and I'm not saying that it necessarily means that, if there is no God, everything would be in flux. You could have no predictability, but I think what naturalism rests in is a lot of randomness. And so it's like you want randomness to be the generator of life, but then you need the constancy and the predictability of it in order to actually do science. So I just have always found that an interesting kind of contradiction in ideas from a lot of the naturalistic atheistic perspective, that it's going to be random genetic mutations and random things through nature. And so there is and not to say that nothing in nature is random. I'm not saying that, but I do think it would be interesting if we could explore and look at if this universe is randomly spit out from something, which I'm not sure what you would say it spit out from. What is it that gives all of these, all of the laws of physics their specificity? Because they have to be those precise values in order for everything to work and for us to actually predict models and to do science. There has to be some predictability and some constancy to those things. That I think when you go back to the origins model of if there's a universe generator from your origins model, what is it that's making this a constant predictability in the laws of physics kind of realm? I guess that was kind of what I was getting at with that statement about. I think that the predictability of this universe is better explained by a God who set the values and the physics and the parameters that allows life to function, set them at those values in order for life to exist.
Gotcha. So yeah, I have never heard the first part of what you said, that because naturalism is contingent on evolution being random, that is in conflict with like the laws of physics being determined. Because my understanding is in like determinism, everything is determined. So we just don't, it's only seemingly random that the particles pair in a certain way, that different nucleotides bond in a certain way, because we just couldn't calculate all the different interactions in the universe. Because if we could, we'd know exactly what would happen. But so those, I would say that the randomness there is more just which ones happen to bond together first because they're closer together. I wouldn't say it's true randomness. It's more just apparent randomness in that case. But to bring up the laws of physics, I would say that why would a God designing them in a certain way be a better explanation than, for example, them being determined by some undiscovered law of physics? So like the grand unification theory says that all the different laws of physics, the four fundamental forces, are interconnected if you raise them to like a high enough temperature or whatever. So it could be the case that all the different constants, the gravitational constant, the light constant, all those different constants could be intertwined in such a way that if you change one, it will cause a proportional change in all the other ones. And why would that be a less plausible explanation than God designing it that way?
Well, I think, even naturalists describe, this is the Goldilocks planet. Why is there the ability for life to exist here? And in all of the the interconnectedness that we have, of, even how oxygen and how water functions, how, carbon dioxide and oxygen between living organisms and plants, and, everything about this planet is precisely what it needs to be in order for life to exist here. And so, I think with your worldview, you'd like to think that it randomly occurred that way. And so it's by happenstance and chance. But I think it's better explained by somebody planning it to be that way than all the cards and everything just fell in line the way that they are. Because I think, when you look at statistics, I think that the mathematical statistical analysis of all of the things that have to be exactly so in order for life to exist here, I think make the probability of that being negligible. I mean, effectively zero when you look at all of the things that have to be exactly what they are for life to exist here. So I think from a probability perspective, it's better explained by somebody designing it that way than it randomly fell into those values and those parameters, so to speak.
Well, for like the Earth, there's billions of planets out there. We've only found like 5,000 Goldilocks planets. That seems to be purely chance, just by the numbers. But in the case of like the laws of physics, why wouldn't it be like, because if we increase the gravitational constant even a little bit, then all particles would just go farther away from one another and never form stars or planets or life or whatever. And if we increase the gravitational constant even a little bit, everything would just collapse into a big black hole and nothing would form. And so if we're asking like, why are the laws of physics the way that they are, why wouldn't saying that they're determined to be that way by the nature of the quantum field or whatever be a worse explanation than a God designing it?
Well, I mean, I guess I could give you the same question. Why is God designing it a worse explanation than it's random?
Well, I'm saying determined. So just to clarify.
Right. Okay.
So it's determined by God designing it versus
right.
determined by quantum physics.
Well, but even think about how you first broached the subject. You said, well, we could have all these different parameters. If they're ratcheted up together, everything could still coexist. There's still you're having to change things all at once. I mean, kind of going back to what we were talking about with Darwinian evolution. If you change one small thing, it wreaks havoc on the organism. If you want to change from the spider to the ant, you have to do a lot of changes at one time. From the caterpillar to the butterfly, you have to do a lot of changes at one time. So even what you're saying with the physics, if we were to mess with one of those parameters, it would wreak havoc. But if we did it with a bunch of them, then you're saying we could still have life here. Is that what you were saying in the beginning?
No, I'm saying like they're all bound together. So if you change one,
Right.
all of the others have to change. There's no
Right.
possible way to change them in different ways. They're all tied
Well,
together by one law.
right. So I think that is evidence of a designer having his hand on that, because I just think that when you look at the probability of all of those things being the values they need to be, all at the same time in order for life to exist here, and because it's not just like, when you look at probability, it's you multiply it, right? So if you have the probability of getting, 3 coin tosses of heads, it's 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2. And so here we're talking about, at least 30 some odd parameters. And it's not, 1/2, 1 out of 2 that it's the number it needs to be. It's 1 out of infinity. You have an infinite number of possible values that each of these things could be on the number line.
Well, that's
So
just to
now you're talking
clarify.
about, yeah.
My argument is that there's something in nature we don't know about yet where they don't have an infinite number of values. There's only one way they could be. It's like a fundamental law in nature that they must be this relation to one another. And so if there's some law that causes all the different, I think it's 160 different constants in physics to all be tied together, and so that they can't be different, they have to be the way that they are, then the probability is actually 1. It means any universe made of quantum fields is going to generate this possibility. And so in that case, it wouldn't have a low probability, it'd have a very high probability. And so my argument is, why would that explanation of making a very high probability universe, like a quantum field that has a nature that will produce the laws this way, be different than saying there's a God who has a nature who will produce the laws this way?
Well, because I think that it is a God that designed the system that way, to have all those specific parameters. Why are there even all those specific parameters? I mean, you have to go back and start explaining, why are there even these laws of quantum physics? Where did those even come from? And that's where I think it comes from a creator who established these things so that life could exist here and not on all the other billions of planets and systems that are out there. There's something very specific about the fact that life exists here. And I don't think that's a random. I think the probability, when you look at it from a probability perspective, I think it's effectively 0, unless somebody designed it that way.
Let me ask you a different way.
Introducing that intelligence into the system that requires somebody to plan these things the way that they are.
Well, let me ask a different way. Who designed God? Why God has a lot of ways he could be. Maybe God might want a universe of only hydrogen atoms, or maybe a universe of only puppies, or universes only black
He could have
holes.
designed it however he wanted. That's true.
Right. So there's lots of different ways God could be, and only a small number of ways God could be would produce a life-forming universe, because maybe he's just only hydrogen atoms, only black holes. For every possible way the universe could be, God could have possibly wanted that way the universe could be. So who designed God to want a life-permitting universe as opposed to one of the infinitely many non-life-permitting universes?
I love that question. That's a really good question. I think, though, when we step back and look at trying to explain, you're kind of getting at the question as far as, who made God, right? And when you stop and think from your worldview, okay, you believe that there is no God and that at one point there was no universe, right?
Our universe. I think there's always a natural thing. I think the quantum field always existed. It's outside of space.
So you think that is infinite?
Yes.
You think that's eternal?
Yep.
Okay, so that's a really different starting point, because I would argue that these universe is not eternal. Because, so what is it that you think about the universe makes it eternal?
our universe had a beginning, but not all natural things had a beginning. So the consensus in physics right now is that space and time are emergent properties from a quantum field. So the quantum field exists outside of our universe, and our universe had a beginning at the Big Bang, but that's not all natural things. It's just our segment of space-time.
Okay, that's a very different proposition than I've heard given before. Because, I mean, even Stephen Hawking's established that there has to be a definite beginning to time and space.
Right.
Mathematically, there's nothing that they can do to bypass the fact that there is a beginning.
Well, there's actually multiple different models, but the space and time are a particular kind of a field, and there are other kinds of fields. So the consensus in physics is that space and time are emergent. They come about from other things that existed before space and time. And these other things
So
are
what, yeah,
quantum
what would
fields.
those things be? So,
Quantum
but
fields.
quantum physics, I mean, explain, I know what that is, so don't give me the like an elementary school definition, but like, how are you saying that this thing existed for an eternity? Like, what are you explaining as that, as its existence? What is that in terms of its eternality?
Oh, I'd say it's outside of space and time. So space and time are a kind of field, and these are different kinds of fields. So these fields exist outside of space and time.
Okay, but what is it acting on, those fields of?
What is it acting on?
Well, are you saying this is a ball of energy that's eternal, a ball of mass that's eternal? When you say quantum physics is eternal, that's quantum physics is explaining things. So, what are you saying is about that that's eternal?
The fields are eternal.
Okay. Okay.
So like space is a field, space-time
Right.
is a field, the gravitational field is a field. The fields
Right.
are the fundamental thing. It's not, and those things, fluctuations in those things is what produces matter and energy.
Okay. So you think that has no beginning?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
And we have good evidence of quantum fields from empirical data from the Casimir effect. The Casimir effect is an experiment where they took two tiny little metal particles, put them together in a vacuum, and to see if virtual particles could push them together. And virtual particles are things that come about from fluctuations in the quantum field. So it's good evidence of the quantum field. And like the multiverse, for example, the multiverse is a
Right.
combination of that plus Guth's early universe inflation, which was observed or made predictions about observations in the cosmic microwave background. So both of those things have good, solid empirical evidence. The pieces of the multiverse, not, we haven't confirmed the multiverse, but all of the pieces in the theory have been shown to be real things. And so your question earlier is, why should this model of the quantum field be better than a god? I would say because all of the pieces in this theory have been confirmed to be in reality and not just a part of our imagination, whereas
Mhm.
the pieces of a god have not been shown to exist in reality outside of our imagination. So like omnipotent, omnibenevolent, all powerful, a mind outside of space-time, like none of those things have been shown to be empirically real, but the Casimir effect and early universe inflation, those have been empirically demonstrated to be real. And so if we're trying to compare which theory is better, I would say one that uses only a combination of things that have been shown to be in reality independent of our imagination is better than one that adds in like an imaginary property that hasn't been shown to be real yet. So like if we see a hoof print in the snow, saying it's a unicorn is not as good as saying it's a horse, because we have past evidence horses are real. We don't have past evidence of unicorns being real. And so that's why I would say that the quantum field explanation is a better explanation of the necessary being than a god.
Okay. Well, I mean, I would say that this universe is finite, right? So if there's a point where there is no God and no universe, we would still have nothing now, right? There would have to be at some point some eternally existent being to bring
Yes.
this universe into existence. And so that's where, that eternally infinite being, I believe is God, and I guess you believe it's the
Quantum
quantum
fields.
physics fields.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that the quantum physics ones are better because they have like empirical data in the world, where I don't think we have any empirical data of like omnibenevolence. I don't think we can empirically demonstrate that.
Okay. Well, I mean, obviously, I'm going to disagree with that, but I think there are a lot of other things about our existence that that science does not explain. That I think they do point to the fact that there is a creator, there is an intelligent being behind this existence that that designed our DNA, that designed our, you know, every organism, that that constructed the laws of physics as they are, that I think imparted to us a sense of morality. I think that's not explained through science. You know, science can explain what things are, but not whether they should or should not be that way, especially when you're talking about that moral and ethical component. And I don't think that evolution gives an adequate explanation as to why we do have this ought and ought not about our existence. The fact that we love, that we have intelligence, that we have creativity, that we have theoretical thinking. I think all of those things are evidence that something more than just a quantum field has imparted to us. Our desire for justice, our desire for integrity, you know, the fact that we look down on treason and we don't uphold liars as being great examples of how to live. I think all of those things also point to something imparting that component to our existence that science itself cannot explain. So I guess that's kind of where I would go to, that it's not just about, you know, I know I started off with saying the irreducibly complex systems and Cambrian explosion, because I do think that scientifically the evidence is better through those two things, that there must be a God. I know you disagree. We talked about all that. But I think there's more to our existence than just what the scientific evidence points to and what physics can explain. And I think all of that stuff taken together, we have to look at what it means to be human in this existence in every aspect of that. And I think those things aren't explained through quantum physics, that we have to figure out, you know, why do we feel, you know, sadness at massive death? Because if evolution is true, then we should celebrate people being eliminated from the gene pool, right? If it's propelling the genetics forward. But that's not how we respond to things like that. And so I think the fact that we sit here and wonder about these things, I think tells us there's something different about being human, something different about our existence that has to be explained in some way too.
Yeah, so a few things there. I think evolution does explain beauty and sadness and justice as being beneficial to a group. So like if we see a large part of our group die, that means that
Okay, I
as
didn't.
a
Sorry,
society.
the internet glitched again. I didn't catch that first part of what you're saying. Say that
Oh
again.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
so sorry.
sure, no problem.
Okay,
I
go ahead.
think that evolution explains justice and meaning and purpose and sadness when people die, because you mentioned that why do we feel sad when a lot of people die? It's because as a society, one that values its members will survive more and live longer if it protects and values their lives, rather than one that doesn't. And we've seen that happen in different kinds of evolutionary experiments. But I wanted to go back to the who designed God, because it seems
Mhm.
like when you're making the design argument, like it seems like there's lots of different ways the universe could be, and there's only a very small number that could allow for life, right? And
Mhm.
that's perplexing. It seems like there's a lot of gray and then a very tiny little spot of red right in the middle where life can exist. And
Mhm.
it seems like God has the same proportions. It seems like there's a lot of ways God could be. Maybe God could want a universe of only black holes. Maybe God could want a universe of only hydrogen atoms. So every possible way the universe could be, there's a possible way God could have wanted that universe instead of this one. And so the spectrum of diversity of non-life permitting universes to life permitting universes is the same spectrum between non-life permitting universes created by God versus life permitting universes that God could want to create. And so it seems like God has the same mathematical probability as the universe, because there's a one-to-one correlation. For each way the universe could be, God could have wanted it to be that way.
Mhm.
And so we have to ask the same question. If this mathematical probability is the design thing we're trying to explain, then it seems to be both in the universe and in God himself. And if the only solution is to say, well, just God isn't designed, then we could just say the same thing about the universe. The universe isn't designed. And I don't see why that's a better explanation, just to say God isn't designed. Because if that's the solution to the problem, why wouldn't that just apply to the universe?
Well, I think with your explanation that quantum fields are eternal, that's That's how you're answering the question. Whereas I answer the question that God is eternal. So God doesn't need a cause or creator. He is that eternally existent being that brought everything else into existence. And so you're answering that question with quantum fields being eternal, and somehow, even though they're not sentient, right? Somehow it brings a universe into being.
Okay, so if it's okay to say that anything that's past eternal doesn't need to be designed and can have like a really complicated nature to it, that seems like if we discovered a computer and you said the computer was past eternal, it wasn't created, but it's still super, super complicated, right? It's a computer. That would be weird, right? You'd say that because it's so complicated, you would want to say it's probably designed.
So wouldn't you want to say that the quantum fields, if you're resting in those being eternal and that they're mathematically complicated, wouldn't that question be valid to you too? That's your supercomputer that's eternal? What created and designed that?
Well, sure. So the quantum fields are actually really, really simple. That's why they're preferred, because they're not complicated. The goal is that there's a simple model or a simple essence to this quantum field that causes all the other complicated things. But the quantum field itself is really simple. Whereas God, with his personality, his intentions, his desires, his all powerfulness, that seems really complicated.
I don't see why that means there couldn't be an eternally existent God just because he's complicated. If he's God and exists eternally, why does that mean he has to start as something simple?
Oh, right. So the argument here is more to say that if you look at the universe and say the universe must be designed because it's complicated, then it seems like we
Oh,
can look at God and say he looks really complicated, he must be designed.
oh, okay. No, I don't think that's an apples to apples kind of comparison. I think, God is. I think it's hard for our finite brains to understand something that's truly eternal. Even if your eternally existent thing is the quantum fields, I think that's hard for us to understand because you still have to explain where would that have come from. So I think what you're pushing back on, you have to answer the same question. Why would there be a quantum field? Where did that existence come from? Right? I mean, you have a hard time in your mind understanding that that's eternal. The same way that we have a hard time understanding that God is eternal. So I think the same question would apply to both worldviews.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Right. So I mean, I guess you would have to answer too.
My
right.
definitely. So my answer is
Yeah.
just that, like the example of the horse print in the snow that I gave before, the better
Right.
model is the one that uses pieces that have all been demonstrated to be in reality and not a part of our imagination. And if you have a prediction or a model that adds things that haven't been demonstrated to be in reality,
Right.
then that's a less good model. And so that's why I
Well,
think
now
the
I
quantum
know
field
you'll
is better.
disagree. I know you'll disagree, but I don't believe that God is in our imagination. And I know you think that he is,
Just to
but
clarify,
that's
I didn't mean to imply that. So I meant to say, like,
okay.
there are certain things we hypothesize, and those things, until they're demonstrated to exist in reality, they're just imaginary concepts. We don't know if they're real or not. And so, like, if we say a property of God, like omnibenevolence or omniscience or something,
Mhm.
those haven't been demonstrated in a lab. We can't prove those exist. Those are right now, we don't have any like hard empirical evidence those are real things. But we do have hard empirical evidence quantum fields are things. We do have hard empirical evidence that goose early universe inflation are things. And so because we have hard empirical evidence of those that show they're not just a part of the imagination of the guys who made them up,
Right.
those models who use only those kinds of things are better than models who add in the things that we don't know are whether or not they're real or imaginary yet.
Well, but you're also discounting uh, experience that people have had, the evidences that people have had through scripture. And I know, that's probably thrown out by you and all of your followers. But I think when you look at how God has interacted with humankind, and when you look at the evidence, especially if you look at Jesus of Nazareth, when you look at the evidence of his life on earth and the resurrection, then you do have, it's not a unicorn of our imagination. So I believe that there is evidence when you look at, the testimony of people's lives as well. And I don't think you can completely discount that, because that is a historical evidencing the same way, if you look at the historical evidence of, Abraham Lincoln. I mean, you can't physically test him in a lab today, but you have the impact on history and the interaction that he had with other people and the effects of his life going forward, the documents that we have that capture what he's done. That's the same type of evidence that you would look at when you see God interacting in this world. So I don't think it's fair to say there is no evidence whatsoever of an omniscient, omnipresent, that type of thing. It's not going to be evidence that that's done in the same way as the field of physics or quantum physics or a lab type scientific method type of way. But we take things for evidence outside of the scientific method every day. I mean, if you go into a courtroom, yes, you can bring in some scientific evidence about certain things, but there's also a lot of weight given to presumption of fact. What is the best explanation of these events? Who was there to witness it? What happened as a result of it? So, we turn to that type of historical type of evidences a lot as well in our day-to-day lives. So that's not an unreasonable realm of evidence to point to.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I think that I definitely believe Jesus existed. I think as a historical figure, he's a real person, not a mythicist. I think those are weird people who think Jesus didn't exist. But I think that I don't think there's evidence he rose from the dead. If he did, that would be evidence of an omniscient being. So Jesus is like, if God is an omnipotent being and he exists, I'm going to rise from the dead in 3 days after I die. 3 days later, he rises from the dead. Yeah, that's a novel testable prediction. That's science. That counts as evidence. That would definitely be.
Well, that's a great place to start. So there's a lot of extra biblical, meaning just outside of the Bible, references that talk about the resurrection, and a lot of historians and archaeologists who have looked through the New Testament accounts as they're digging in the dirt over there in the Middle East. They look to the writings of Paul, and specifically to Luke's account in the Book of Acts. And how precise he is in his historical record of all of just the historical events that happened in that time, all of the references to the terrain, to the people, to the family histories of all the Herods that ruled over in Palestine in that time. That a lot of them have been led to understanding that if Luke is writing all of this and it's so confirmed factually, if everything else that he's writing about in archaeology and history, everything's being confirmed by everything that they find, and he's writing a lot about the life of Paul. And so then you can trust that what he's writing about Paul is true. Well, everything Paul did was based off of him seeing the resurrected Jesus. And when you go back and you look at the changed lives of the disciples, that is the eyewitness testimony account that verifies that something happened significantly after Jesus was crucified. And you can look at that information even outside of just the biblical writers. But even if you look at the biblical writers, when you look through the Gospels, especially of Matthew and John, because they were two of the disciples that were with Jesus and they saw all of these things, and they're writing them down with much personal cost, right? They didn't write it down to get a book deal and be famous on YouTube and make billions of dollars. They wrote it down and then were persecuted for it. And so at any point they could have changed that and said, okay, never mind. I kind of don't want to be persecuted for what I'm claiming. So I think there's a lot of evidences that you could go in and explore that do affirm that a resurrection took place. Even the fact that, Jesus's brothers didn't believe that he was really the Son of God and what all was going to take place until after they saw the resurrection. And then, his half brother James became the founder of the church in Jerusalem. So there's a lot of testimonial and ancient writing, first century writings that talk about the resurrection.
Yeah. So I've done quite a bit of research in that. You mentioned the courtroom example. I'm a big fan of the courtroom example. In a court case, if you bring up evidence of anything that doesn't have any precedent is the technical legal term, then it's essentially immediately thrown out. So if you said, I saw a leprechaun kill Bob or whatever, they're not going to take you seriously. That doesn't count as evidence. You're not going to count someone who summoned the leprechaun and tried to put them in jail for killing Bob. It's like doesn't count as evidence. And it's the same for anything that are like miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs. None of those things are accepted in the courtrooms. Like that, those aren't evidence. Like you got to have precedent for it to count as evidence. And this is essentially the same kind of principle I was using earlier, is that it only counts as evidence if it already has like an empirical basis in reality for history in courtrooms. So for history in courtrooms, even though Pliny the Younger and Pliny the Elder were really great historians and had lots of accurate historical data, we don't take their initial accounts of the foundation of Rome to be seriously, because they said that Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, who were raised by a wolf. And that was like, no, we don't think that's true. Even though they got everything else right about history, we think they probably got that one wrong because it's a miracle, kind of a miraculous claim. And the same thing applies to the cases of all historical documents. We take the claims that are mundane, like I saw a dog, very seriously. Like, yes, if they're a reasonable, accountable historian, they probably got that one right. But any kind of miraculous claims they make, we say that's probably not right. That's probably something they added in. It's in the tradition of most historians back then to add in mythical tales like Romulus and Remus. And so the fact that the historians who wrote the Bible, who I don't think any of the Gospels actually wrote it themselves, because it's written in Greek and they didn't know Greek. But even if they did, even if these were literal eyewitness testimonies today, we wouldn't really count that as evidence for the resurrection. We would count it as probably a natural explanation that we didn't understand, or that they probably thought they saw something that they didn't. So, for example, all the different testimonies of Paul and the apostles can be explained by bereavement delusion. Bereavement delusions are a thing that happens to like 60% of people, where they have a loved one die and they have visions and they can hear the loved one after they're dead, and they have interactions with the loved one after they're dead. And this is a very common occurrence in humans for dead loved ones. If you have a loved one die, you are very likely to see a bereavement delusion. And so that seems like,
well, some of the studies about that though is I mean, we can all have a delusion in some respects, like, you know, when you think you hear your cell phone ring, or it's in your pocket and you think you feel it vibrate. But to have the tactile and the audio and the visual all at the same time is not common. That's a very, very low percentage of, you know, the most common thing is that you think you see something, right? But when the disciples interacted with Jesus, they ate with him, they touched him, they heard him speak, they saw him, they walked with him. And it wasn't just the disciples. It was, you know, he appeared before crowds. He appeared to right. So there's lots of other interactions with him. And when you think about all the other witnesses that saw the miracles, you know, when he feeds the 5,000, how many witnesses were there? You know, that's not just 3 people said they saw something. So especially when you look at other religions, where it is typically one man with one private vision that then writes it down for everyone else to just trust him on what he saw. Okay, so when you look at Muhammad, that's how Islam began, was that Muhammad claimed he had a vision. He then comes and recites it to everybody. Everyone just has to trust that's what he saw in the cave. That's not what's happening here in Jesus's ministry, because he's doing it in public. And that's something even Paul said when he's brought before, you know, the Roman governor Festus. And he says, I'm telling you these things and you're aware of that because this wasn't done in a corner. When you feed 5,000 people, there are 5,000 witnesses to the miracle. He then feeds 4,000. And of course, you know, most scholars say that's simply counting the adult men. That's not all the women and children who were there. When he's going from town to town to town, you know, it's masses of people constantly following him and asking him for healing, witnessing, listening to him teach. The Pharisees, who did not believe him, were witnesses to all of this. So it's not just, you know, the small band of people who were, you know, committed to this cult leader, and they really grieved when he was killed, and now they think they saw him. It's much bigger and more beyond that. When you look at the documentation of the resurrection, it's very different from when you look at other religions.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean there, because when I look at other religions, like the feeding the 5,000 is a good example. Santi Sai Baba is a Hindu. He had 10,000 and did something very similar, and you can find videos of it on YouTube where he did miracles in front of these 10,000 Hindus within the past 100 years. That seems to be like a common thing that faith healers and faith practitioners did all throughout time, because there are certain kinds of miracles that you can do that convince a lot of people whether or not they're true or not. And so that the kinds of miracles that are done by Jesus seem to be the same kinds of miracles done by all of the other faith healers at the same time period, and before and after and during recent time
Well,
periods.
I disagree, because he had so many different types of miracles that he did to show his power over everything. Because I mean, if he truly is God coming down to earth, he has power over everything, right? He has power over the food that he can multiply to feed the thousands. He has power to heal the leper, to raise someone from the dead. He has power to walk on water and calm the storm. So it's that's not just some sleight of hand mythical healer mystic in the woods type thing. So
Well, just
casting out demons
what
there.
what
So there's a lot of different miracles that were done, that I think separate what Jesus did from what you're talking about.
well, the reason I brought that up was because all of those things you listed are the common types of things that faith healers are recorded to have done during that time period a lot. The walking on water thing, the healing the sick, the healing the lepers, that's all stuff that was really, really common back then. Jesus was essentially doing the same kinds of miracles that all of the different other people were claiming to do, both before and after Jesus. It was like those are common miracles that were claimed. And so in recorded history, he didn't really do anything that was super special other than raising from the dead. That one's pretty special. I'll grant
Okay,
that one.
so that is the
But
deal clincher,
yeah.
I guess, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. If there's actual, if we could actually see Jesus rise from the dead, I would absolutely count that as evidence for God. But like I mentioned earlier, in a court case and in history, we don't count testimony of miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, because all of the testimony from all of the different religions that have those things seem more likely to be fabrications or made up or mistakes. And so the same reason we don't accept it in these other religions like Santi Sai Baba or the origin of Rome or the Iliad and the Odyssey or any of these claims is the same reason we don't accept them in the Bible from a historical perspective or from a legal perspective. And so it seems strange to want to accept these testimonies in this case when we don't accept the testimony in any other case in history.
Okay. I guess what do you want me to answer there with that? Like, why would I believe that over all the others?
Yeah, sort of. So why should we accept the testimony of the people who saw miracles in the Bible versus the testimony of the people who saw miracles in every other religion versus the testimony of people who saw miracles in the courtrooms today, or UFOs or leprechauns? It seems like all of those are in the same category that we probably shouldn't accept them. And the testimony on its own isn't enough to justify miracles. You need the precedent in the legal case, some kind of empirical
Okay.
test.
Well, I think as far as what's happened through the scriptures, I think there's it's more than just one person that lives in the desert in Arizona saying he saw a UFO. I think there's more people that are giving this testimony. I think there's more miracles done by the same person. I think you have to look at also the what and how he was teaching, the authority with which he had over what he was instructing the people in, plays into it. So I'm saying it's all of these things coming together, but I think it really does come down to the resurrection. I mean, because you could try to explain away, maybe there was some, trick to feeding the 5,000 and maybe it was an illusion that he walked on water. I disagree. I think those really happened. And I think, there is enough evidence and testimony to say that it really happened, especially when you look at the 4 gospel writers and particularly Luke, and how he approached it almost as like the investigative journalist, that he's going to interview everybody and pull all this together as one account, one orderly record of what all happened. But I think you can also look at the change in the people's lives and what they were willing to sacrifice for it. Now, we have people willing to die for kooky spiritual leaders all the time. But I think the difference when you look at the disciples and what they were willing to endure, and especially Paul, but all of them, what they were willing to walk through, if it were not true, they would have been the ones that were lying about it, right? So they would have known that this is not true if it was all a fabrication. And so it would be, it's hard to convince me that these men would be willing to suffer what they went through, be persecuted and executed for these claims if they were lying about it. And I think there were enough of them that it's not just a delusion. So that's kind of what I fall back to is that, when you look at it, the resurrection, Jesus claimed to be God and he did all the things to back it up. And the resurrection is what shows that he truly is God. And I think all other type of alternate theories that try to explain away the resurrection, they fail to either explain the resurrection appearances or the empty tomb. And when you fail to look at those things, I think the alternate theories that try to explain away the resurrection are very weak, and they fail. So, dude says he's God, he resurrects. I tend to believe that.
So I think that the apostles definitely believed what they said, but I don't think the level of conviction of their beliefs counts as evidence for the truth of their beliefs. It just counts that they definitely believed it.
It does. Okay. So it says they definitely believed it, which means they're not lying.
Right.
Okay. So that in and of itself does not say that they weren't delusional about it. I don't think that they were because of everything else. But it definitely tells us they were not lying about it. And I think that that should weigh heavily in our consideration of whether to believe them or not.
I'm not so sure because there's lots of people who believe things that are untrue. There are flat earthers who genuinely believe the world is flat.
That's true. But if they had walked off the edge of the earth and then came back and told us the earth is flat and there was a whole bunch of them that did it and then their lives were completely changed by it, I might give more weight to that, right? And so I think that would be the equivalent of the testimony of the apostles. So that they were there witnessing everything. The way they witnessed the resurrection was not typical of what a delusion, bereavement, vision, what you were talking about. That's far beyond what just the typical, I had a hallucination. I had a vision of someone that I really loved that passed away. There were more witnesses to that than how that theory would be valid, if that makes sense, how I said that.
Well, I'm not sure. So like in most historical cases, you have a bereavement delusion of some kind. And then in the texts, because these were written 40, 50 years after the events, they get extrapolated, they get expanded. Like the telephone game, the story gets, I forget what the word is. It starts with an E, but they get engrossed in some way beyond what actually happened. So I think the most plausible explanation is they had a bereavement delusion, which does happen in groups, and you can have all kinds of both auditory, physical, and tactile responses in bereavement delusions. That is actually a thing that we see in groups called communal reinforcement.
But not all at the same time.
Yeah, the communal
In the same
reinforcement.
way.
So it's in the same way.
No. I mean, like, it's not common that you would have the tactile, the audio, the visual delusion at the same, all of those senses triggered at the same time.
Right. They're not common, but it does happen. So like there's communal reinforcement where a group of people sitting at a table will all have the same experiences, which happens in many different cases. It's just the term is communal reinforcement is how to explain that. And there are also cases where thousands of people would see UFOs at the same time, like the miracle, I think the Mary miracle in South America or something, where tens of thousands of people saw the sun move or something. Those are also really common. And so all of the different things that occurred in the Bible seem to be very well explained by things we can explain today as scientific occurrences. So I don't see why that would be. And again, I don't think we should accept them because of the courtroom basis of evidence. Is we got to have a precedent for it.
Well, so it's not. It's so in that line of reasoning, it's the I'm going to throw out any miracles because I don't believe miracles exist, and that is circular logic there. So,
well, do you think courts should allow miracle claims as evidence today?
I think it would depend. I'm not saying just carte blanche, everyone that says a miracle has happened or they saw a UFO, that everyone should take their word for it. But I think when you look at the biblical accounts of Jesus' life, his ministry, his death, his resurrection, and even the writings that are not the biblical authors, I think all of that gives weight to what the gospel writers claim. And I think we would do well to do the same thing with someone in the courtroom. You know, if there's a totality of evidences that combine that support their testimony, you can't just throw out their testimony just because you don't like what they say.
Oh, right. I would agree, but I think that the totality of evidence thing would have to include some kind of empirical precedent to say that it's possible that this thing is real. I don't think until you have that testimony counts.
But I think that's what they've proven through the gospel accounts, that when they have eaten with him, they have touched him, they have seen him, they have talked with him. He then, lived on earth for another 40 days before he ascended into heaven. The number of people that witnessed that at different times in different places. So it wasn't just this, a mass amount of people and one person said, oh, I see, whatever. And they all just kind of chime in because of the mob crowd. These were several different appearances that I think that removes the mass delusion type of thing experience off the table. And it's triggering all of those senses in all of those encounters at the same time. So I think that's a different type of evidence than what you're talking about. And you're kind of trying to discount, delusions, because delusions happen. They do happen. But I think when you look at what all the eyewitness accounts, all the interactions that he's had, it starts lessening the idea that was just a delusion experience by these 12 men or these 11 men at one time, because it happened on so many different occasions, because there were all the senses triggered on all of those occasions, that it's more than one group of people. It's not even the same people every time. Then, the fact that word of this spread throughout the region, and then we have all of the writings of people who are not sympathetic to Jesus being the Savior. When you have, everything that happens through the book of Acts, when you continue to look at what changes occurred as a result of this resurrection appearance, I think you can't discredit that. You can't just say, oh, well, these people do. You have to look at all of those things together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So we've been going for about an hour and a half. So before we wrap up, we have a few super chats if you don't mind answering.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Okay, so the first one is, what does she think about evolution being used nowadays to design everything from watches to architecture to medicine?
What do I think about evolution being used to design watches?
Yeah, so I think the argument is that using evolution as a way to design things better than designers do. And so evolution seems as a better way or better explanation of complex design than designers, because it can do it better than designers.
Well, I guess from the watchmaker argument debunked. So I'm not sure what he's asking me to talk about.
So he's asking that today in design architecture, we use evolutionary processes in computers to do all the design work for us, to tell us what the best designs are. We don't design them. We don't use intelligent designers to design them. We use evolution to design them because it does it better than we do.
All right. Well, there's still that. Well, I think that's kind of a misrepresentation. There's still an intelligence involved somewhere. So, if we can program something that goes through different iterations to tell us the best design, we have to set the parameters of what that best design is. We have to set, what is it considering? Is that manufacturable? I think you can't just pull out any intelligence out of that completely. So I think that's not looking at truly a naturalistic approach of evolution when you're using programs or iterations or, value judgments, there still has to be some sort of intelligence involved in the process. So I don't think that's a one-to-one comparison of what Darwinian evolution is requiring, because that has to be completely natural. You have no idea what the genetic mutation is going to do. You have no idea if it's going to reverse a genetic mutation done before. You still have to design the watch or the architecture, or whatever, as a whole. So recently I read an article that was trying to compare, the evolution of planes to say that proves evolution. Well, yes, you can see a progression from the Wright brothers simple plane to a Boeing 747, but you can't incrementally make each change and it still work, right? You couldn't put a Boeing 747 engine on a Wright brothers, biplane or whatever, and it work. You have to change all of the features together in order to get something that's going to, in the biological sense, survive and reproduce. A hybrid plane in between, without considering what is it going to do to the fuel system and the landing gear and the wing structure, and the steering mechanism. You have to look at all of that at once. And so I don't think that's a fair representation of what truly Darwinian evolution is trying to accomplish.
Gotcha. All right, the next one's from Travis Statham. Does God have a designer to be complex enough to create? So, like, to be able to create, it seems like he's saying that requires a lot of complexity, which would require a greater designer. I think it's the same argument.
Okay, so I do think God is complex. And I think he is intelligent enough to design this universe and everything in it. And I think that is the best explanation to the complexity that we see here on Earth and in the universe.
I think he's arguing that because he's complex, he must have had a creator or designer of himself. God must have been designed by a designer, I think is his argument.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I think that, there has to be an infinite, self-existent being somewhere for anything to exist. And so I don't think that God requires a creator, because God is outside of this universe. So he is outside of time, space, energy, and matter. And so he is very different from our existence, because everything in our existence that we see is finite and degrading and breaking down. Our second law of thermo there, all things tend toward entropy. So there's nothing in this universe that's eternal. That means whatever eternally existent, self-existent being is out there is different from everything that we see here. So I think how we try to define him in the same terms as what we see here, we're kind of limited by those terms. But he is infinite and self-existent and necessary in order for anything else to exist from that.
Gotcha. And next one's from Tim West. Joseph Smith had witnesses who claimed to have seen the golden plates from which Smith translated the Book of Mormon. Is that good evidence of Mormonism?
No. No, it's not. And I don't think that compares to what we have in Scripture. So Joseph Smith actually didn't, he might have claimed to have had witnesses, but he didn't, that he found it individually, and that he had to have special glasses from which to translate the golden plates. But what's on the golden plates and the history that he gives of Mormonism, it fails because there's not the archaeological evidence of that. There was supposed to be this epic battle in New York between these two people groups, basically, and there's no evidence of that whatsoever. So even if he had, an eyewitness to the golden plates, the information contained on the golden plates is not backed up by archaeological evidence. Whereas when we look at the scriptures, the information contained within the Bible does have that archaeological evidence throughout. The more we dig over there, the more we find confirmation of what we see in the scripture. So I don't think that's a fair comparison at all, if that's kind of where you're trying to go with that question.
Awesome. I think that's it for the super chats. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. Would you like to give another shout out where people can find your book and any other information if they want to check out your stuff?
Sure. So my website is defendthefaithministry.com. The book is Teaching Others to Defend Christianity. So you can get that on Amazon or barnesandnoble.com, or you can go to my website and find it there. Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Absolutely. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful day.
All right. You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.